Later on, we're going to welcome Neil Gartshorne, but first of all, I just want to go through 1 or 2 things. I wanted to remind everybody about a walk to Farlington Marshes on December the 12th, led by Bob Lyle. And after Christmas, when we come back in the new year, on January the 4th, we've got to talk about the sparrows of Lundy. I also want to mention now some bird sightings. I was really excited the other day because I was in the kitchen and said to my dad, Dad, there's a rare bird on the bird bath, and it was a house sparrow. Now, I haven't had a male house sparrow in our garden for years and years, and he came back and he was actually chirruping, which is something I hadn't heard in our garden for ages. So that was good bird sighting for me. Last time when I was here, I didn't actually mention that Fiona Farnsworth said that she had a corn bunting in her back garden. She lives at Frog Mill at Hurley, and she was really happy to have a corn bunting in her back garden, which would be quite nice, wouldn't it? I hear that there have been glossy ibises and a peregrine or peregrines, I'm not sure about whether it's more than one at Moor Green, a black redstart and a merlin at QMR, and up to 7 red-crested pochards at Hose Hill. Now, is there anybody here who has anything else that they've seen, either in their garden or anywhere in the area?
I had a call today from Richard Sledger, who probably was with Ralph and Bert and the others at the time. It's Moor Green, right by the end of Stelton Lane, 2 firecrests, what I believe is probably the usual area. I
actually should have mentioned that because I can see I have written firecrest as well after glossy ibis and peregrine. Yeah, so also firecrest at Moor Green, seen by Richard Sadjak. That's the man that made those lovely nesting boxes. And I have 2 more left over, by the way, if anybody would like one. Right, anybody else seen anything exciting? Silence.
In Berkshire.
In Berkshire. Yes, in Berkshire. Thank you. No.
I don't know if it's regarded as exciting.
Yeah.
Possibly a function of how mild it's been. It seems to be a hell of a lot of chit-chats still around.
Okay.
Bearing in mind we are December tomorrow.
Yes.
Where you normally expect them to move into the chit-chats only in a few select spots.
Okay.
So whether the colder weather is that.
So Neil Bucknell is saying that he has seen and heard a lot of chiff-chaffs around the area, which is quite unusual considering it's December tomorrow. Right, now, to get on to the main event, Neil Gartshorne, who has come all the way from Wareham in Dorset, he of Calluna Books, has come to talk to us about giant petrels and the Sub-Antarctic Skua. Calluna, I just thought I'd tell you this, Calluna, he got the name from the name of Heather or Ling. He was working in Dorset on the heathlands, and Ling is actually called Calluna vulgaris, and that's where the name Calluna Books came from, I do believe. And of course, the logo just had to be the Dartford warbler. So Neil was born in Leicestershire, and he developed an interest in natural history at a very early age. I'm cutting this very short, actually, his history, but he left school and he volunteered on the RSPB reserves. There he developed a fascination for seabirds. He left the bank. To move on, he then worked in a bank, left the bank, and took up a conservation post on the Farne Islands, which sounds wonderful. He travelled to South Africa and studied seabirds on Marion Island, which is one of the Sub-Antarctic Prince Edward Islands. So he's now going to tell us tonight, I'm sure, about the 2 of the giant petrels and the Sub-Antarctic Skua. So can we welcome Neil Gartshorne to the club? Thank you.
All right, good evening, everybody. I better just slightly correct the title of the talk. It's got giant petrels and skuas in it, but it's not about them. It's about the whole experience of the work on there, just in case you're expecting an in-depth ecology of the giant petrels. Right, just bear with us a sec. Right, just before I start, I have a couple of adverts. As Sue was saying, I make a living nowadays out of buying and selling natural history books. And I also publish the Birdwatchers Yearbook for those of you that are here. I've brought a very tiny selection with me. But the talk itself, nothing's happening. No, nothing's happening. I'm trying to move it and nothing. Oh, there's a guy, is it? Oh, it's not moving. Sorry, it's not moving. It's not moving in front of me, but it's moving behind me. Well, that's fine. Well, I'll have to keep looking. Is that it? Hey, right. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, the talk is about the sub-Antarctic experience, and it's probably going to take half the talk just to explain the hows, the whys, and the wherefores. So, in a very brief sort of 30 seconds, back in the mid-1980s, end of '84, I had 3 months in South Africa visiting friends and travelling around the country. Found out about it when I was in Cape Town about this place called Farne Island, which really intrigued me, being seabirds and being very interested in seabirds. And to cut a long story short, lots of toing and froing. But by 1986, I was back out in the country, getting a work permit in readiness for potentially having a job for over a year on the Prince Edward Islands in the Sub-Antarctic. And after a few trials and tribulations, on the 15th of April 1986, the journey actually began. Finally had my I failed my medical because I had a blocked up sinus, so I ended up in a hospital. Finally got a work permit after quite a bit of a hassle, going up and down many visits to various government departments. But by the 15th, everything was loaded on board, the ship was sailing, and on a really nice, clear autumn's day, we headed out of Cape Town Harbour and started the journey south. We were crammed into the boat. The ship goes down to the islands twice a year, once in the autumn and again comes back in the spring. The autumn trip is also the trip which changes over the personnel down there. There's a weather station with 7 personnel on the island. They're there 24/7, 365 days of the year. And they have a year's contract to be down there. And then there's a various number of sort of biologists that go down from time to time, including on this trip for myself. There was myself to work with birds, and another guy who was an entomologist working on insects. So we spent 4 days from leaving Cape Town to actually getting to the islands. We were sharing bunks on the way down. Some people just disappeared on day 1. We saw them on day 4. But I spent quite a bit of time on the back of the boat, on the stern of the boat, on the heli deck, just getting used to some of the birds I was going to see on the journey down there. And this is, I'm not sure whether the boat is straight or the horizon straight, but it was quite a choppy journey down, going into what's known as the Roaring Forties. The ship itself was an old Japanese icebreaker, so it had a round bottom, so it tended to slide from side to side quite frequently on the waves as we were passing south. But it was a great opportunity to get to see some birds that were not actually on the islands. These are pintado petrels or Cape pigeons. They breed further south towards Antarctica, but during the autumn and the winter they move further north towards the African coast. So birds like that were going to be seen, rather than having them on the islands later. A couple of unusual things. We're 3 days out of Cape Town in the middle of nowhere, and a cattle egret flew by the side of the boat and landed. Where on earth it came from, where it was going to, who knows? I'm sure a lot of birds like this go out into the oceans and probably end up perishing. But I think during my stay on Marion, we had, I think, about 4 or 5 cattle egrets. So it's obviously a little bit more common than you would expect. So after 4 days of the journey south, we finally saw the islands. This was a sort of typical autumn's day, a lot of low cloud, choppy seas. Once we hit the island on the northern edge, we just sailed eastwards towards the area where the base was, where we were going to be staying for the next 12 months. And the first job was to get all the personnel off the ship. So there was a lot of extra people down on these, what they would call takeovers, when they were taking the staff and changing them. Lots of people were going down to update the buildings, lots of construction work going on, restocking and all the rest of it. And finally, once all those people were off the ship, the team that was to be there for the next 12 months, we had the last flight ashore before the evening. And this was home for a year, or just over a year. Prefabricated buildings, run by diesel generator. This is all pre-solar panel days and wind power days, but very sort of rustic and basic, but certainly a great place to be for an experience. So if you're not quite sure where we're going, if you look at the sort of middle of the picture, you've got Cape Town there, the top of the dotted line. It's literally almost a straight line for about 2,300 kilometres southeast. And you come to a little group of islands called the Prince Edward Islands. And I'll come on to that a little bit later about the sort of how they got the name and everything. But Prince Edward Islands is made up of 2 islands. The larger one is Marion and the smaller one is Prince Edward. But collectively they're known as Prince Edward Islands. And it's part of a number of Southern Ocean islands. If you go to the east a bit further, you've got the Crozet and Kerguelen Islands, which are French possessions. Just south of Kerguelen, you've got McDonald and Heard, which are Australian. So there's very limited land masses in that part of the world, but just a lot of these very small oceanic Sub-Antarctic islands. The island itself is actually outside of the Antarctic convergence, so it's free from ice. The top right-hand corner of the map there, you can see the large arrow. That's where Prince Edward is, and then the blue line going around Antarctica is the sort of edge of the Antarctic convergence. So you don't expect to see ice beyond that blue line, and then fairly rarely after that. But we did have one iceberg float by the island, which looked rather surreal. This huge, almost ship-like thing travelling northwards. It's the first one that had been seen from the islands for 20 years. We saw this sort of mid-80s. The previous one had been in the mid-60s. So it did give us a little bit of a feeling for Antarctica, but I'd say it was a very rare occurrence. So I've mentioned the islands, Marion and Prince Edward. Marion Island is the larger of the 2. Sorry, the maps are not very good, but the one on the left gives you an idea of the size and shape of the island. It's 290 square kilometres, and that's about the same size, the same landmass as Malta. And it's more or less circular. You can see from the lines on the map, some are very tightly packed, which are areas where it's very steep, and some of them are more spaced out, where you have the more coastal plains around the edge of the island. The small blue dot just right of centre is where the base was located on the island. The map on the right actually shows you, it's a volcanology map showing the origins of the islands. The island's part of a chain really that goes from, I think it's from Iceland up in the north, down through the North Atlantic, down past Tristan da Cunha and Gough, around the corner to Prince Edward and Kerguelen's. It's a single underwater mountain, if you like, and then there's these few islands which pop up, break the surface here and there, of which so Prince Edward and Marion are 2 of them. And just the different colours on the map just show you the different age structures of the rock on the island. The little round red ones are what I call the volcanic chimneys, and right in the very centre you have that sort of very pale blue little mark, and that's a glacier. If you go into the centre of the island, there's no great reason for actually going into the centre of the island. There's virtually no life there whatsoever. But we did have a little bit of time off from time to time, and a couple of occasions had walks into the interior, well above the vegetation line, just to get a feel for the island. And the higher up you go, the more volcanic it becomes. No vegetation, and very obvious rock structures, which show the volcanic origins of the islands. And the islands, the oldest parts of the islands, are estimated to be about 500,000 years old, about 500,000 years old. And just back up down towards the coast on a winter's day when there's a scattering of snow around, it shows up the volcanic chimneys very well. Sort of radiating from the centre of the island down to the coast. This is the ice plateau right at the top of the island. The big black cliff at the back of the picture is actually a block of ice, and this is just a remnant of the last ice age that would have covered the island, which was probably about 10,000 years ago. So just a small remnant left. And then moving down towards the coast, with the volcanic activity, with glaciation over 500,000 years, the rocks have been weathered. The ice has gone over the rocks and come back and all the rest of it. So a lot of the areas are showing this grey mass of fairly flat, well-weathered stone, and that's pre last glaciation, so that's at least 10,000 years old, and it could be up to sort of 200,000–300,000 years old. And that's quite common on lots of the ridges going down towards the sea. But then we get fresh volcanic activity, and that's activity since the last ice age, so within the last 10,000 years. And you can see all the black rocks scattered through this valley here, very sharp, very jagged, quite interesting to actually try to walking through it. You can just see in the photo there, just sort of left of centre, there's a little square box, and that's one of the field huts that are dotted around the islands. I'll come on to those a little bit later. So I think really what I've tried to do with the talk is to try to give you an overview of what it was like down there, have a look at some of the habitats and some of the birds, and then later on towards the end, look at some of the work I was involved with and just some of the experience really of a very special time. So I'm going to start off with the beaches. So there's no beaches, it's not like the sandbanks beach that we have down in Bournemouth and Poole, where people go sunbathing, but there's a few what I would call sandy beaches, but the sand is actually black lava sand. And they're very, very few, and they're quite well scattered around the islands, but they make great sort of places for birds like the king penguin, which is one of the 4 penguin species on the island. During the autumn, after they finish breeding, they molt, and when they're molting, they tend to stay on land rather than go out to sea. So places like these sandy beaches are ideal places for the king penguins to come and finish their molt. And the other animal you'll find on the beaches as well, which are readily accessible, are elephant seals. These are all young elephant seals, maybe yearlings, maybe a couple of years old. And again, they come out and they'll molt during the end of the sort of pupping season, before they go off into the sea to start their lives. Some beaches are a bit more spectacular than others. This is, again, it's another bay where it's a little bit more rocky here rather than the sandy beach. But here you've got a photo, the bottom layer inside the crescent, going to the back of the photo, to the right. You've got 80,000 pairs of king penguins nesting there. And then on the slope above that, the sort of flatter piece, you've got 200,000 pairs of macaroni penguins. And I should know, I counted most of them. You can't quite see it in this photo, but in the bay where the water's breaking, that little white, the white waves, somewhere along that cliff, the green cliff, there's a little red hut where I spent many a day observing giant petrels and skuas interacting with the penguin colonies. I'll come on to that a little later. So here, 280,000 pairs of penguins in a relatively small area. And the bay was extremely important for killer whales. They often came, they came in the summer, and obviously they're always looking for food. So anywhere that penguins have to come ashore or seals have to come ashore are potential feeding sites for killer whales. So frequent killer whale sightings in some of these bays. So I'm going to look at the king penguin first. This is a sort of typical king penguin creche. All the white birds are adults, all the brown birds are youngsters, and they've got to an age where the parents leave them while they go off to sea to fish, to find food for the chicks. And the chicks, for safety, they creche together in quite large numbers, so safety in numbers from the predatory birds that are on the islands. And quite a few of these fairly large colonies are scattered across the two islands of the group. King penguin, so it's the largest penguin on the island, so it's the second largest penguin compared to the largest is obviously the emperor penguin, but this is the next largest. And they have quite a long breeding season. If they're successful, they tend to take about over 12 months, maybe about 13 months from courtship, laying, hatching, raising a chick. So they will probably breed once every 2 years if they're successful, but if they're not successful, depending when they fail, they can breed in consecutive years or attempt to breed in consecutive years. And that's a king penguin close up. I've had to put some prompts in the bottom corner there. So there's 228,000 pairs of king penguins on Prince Edward's, which equates to about 30% of the world's population. So an extremely important island group for this one species. These are very curious little things. You can just sit there in the middle of a penguin colony and they'll come and have a look at you. They'll come and prod you and poke you and try to get a reaction from you. And if you get up quickly, they just turn tail and run, stop, turn around and look at you. So it's I never like putting human traits into birds and animals, but these do give you an impression of a bit of a humanness about them. The second penguin, or the most numerous penguin on the island, is macaroni. So this is a sort of medium-sized penguin, if you like. And all these penguins, obviously, they have to go to sea to feed. They feed on squid and fish. And as the chicks are growing, both parents have to be at sea a lot more, while the youngsters are creched, waiting to be fed. So the birds, they come back into these beaches, usually the boulder beaches, sometimes the sandy beaches, and then they make their way up to their colonies. In some cases, these pathways have been there for millennium, and so all these penguins climbing up through this gap in the cliff, they've been doing this for tens of thousands of years. And if you look at the rocks that they're walking over, they're just all scratched to pieces. You know, years and years and years of penguins' claws going on the rocks. And some of these penguins travel quite a distance from arriving out of the sea onto the beach, and then walking up into the colony to find their own chick and their own mate. And that's a macaroni penguin colony there. They go right the way up to the top of the highest peak. So they'll come in off the beach, well below, maybe about 30 or 40 meters below where we're standing, where the photo was taken. They'll climb up all these little penguin paths, and then they'll just climb and climb and climb until they get to their nest sites. So some of them can walk for maybe 2 or 3 miles until they actually get to their own nest and their own mate. And quite a spectacular view here. You can just see how they use every bit of space they can. These are all sort of ledges. It's an old volcano that had collapsed, but created a lot of open space and ledges where the macaroni penguins could nest relatively safely away from the sea. And you'd think nesting and breeding in this close proximity, they'd be they wouldn't bother each other, but there's constant fights going on throughout 24 hours. You know, if you get near to another pair, they'll have a go at you. So if you nest at the very top of the pile, you have to run the gauntlet of thousands of beaks all the way up. And this is so there's about 460,000 pairs of macaronis breed here, which represents about 12% of the population. This is a pair that's actually molting. The bird on the right is just a variation of the norm. It's like the bridled and the unbridled guillemot. The macaroni penguins have the same. Some of them have white faces in smaller numbers, but the majority of them have black faces. And again, as with the king penguins, once they finish breeding, they have to molt all of their feathers out before they go off to sea again and start the cycle all over again. And a bird you'll find, this is the only sort of land bird that you'll find on the islands. Well, I think it's a land bird. It's like a little bantam, really. It's a sheathbill. There's an American sheathbill over in the Falklands and other parts of Sub-Antarctica, and this is the lesser sheathbill, or the black-faced sheathbill, and it's only found on the Prince Edward's, Crozet and Kerguelen Islands, so it's very limited distribution worldwide, and there's probably about 1,500 pairs nest on Prince Edward's. Most of them sort of associate with a lot of the penguin colonies, anywhere they can get a free meal. It's just like a load of bantams running around a penguin colony. They're always looking for something for nothing. Apart from the sandy beaches, the other beaches we get are rocky beaches, sort of boulder beaches, and these are favoured by and large by two of the species of fur seals that are found on the islands. You can just see scattered amongst the rocks here, slightly different coloured rocks. These are all Sub-Antarctic fur seals. That's a male Sub-Antarctic fur seal. They're about 140 kilos. They're very aggressive when the females are ready to mate again, and they take up territory. And then when the females have had their pups, they stand and are ready to mate again. The dominant males will try to service as many females as they can. But it's one of the animals that we had to be very, very careful about when we were walking around the islands, and we had to give them a lot of respect and stay well clear, so particularly when the females were ready to mate, because you didn't want to tangle with one of these things. And the females much smaller, maybe about, I don't know, about 50 kilos. And the pup, when they're born, they're about 10, 15 kilos, so very much smaller than the male. And the population of the Sub-Antarctic fur seal, the tropicalis, is about 20,000 population. So that's the whole population, not just the number of pups that are born every year. And one thing that's unique about Marion Island, Prince Edward Islands, is we get both the Sub-Antarctic and the Antarctic fur seal breeding on the same site. And this is the male Antarctic fur seal, Gazella. Again, 140, 150 kilos, a huge male. Takes up territory. They tend to be slightly further behind the beaches rather than in the rocky beaches. And there's probably a population of around 2,000 animals using the Prince Edwards. And again, the dominant males just has a little harem of females waiting for them to come in season again once they've had their pups, ready to mate before they go off for the winter. And it's been quite interesting that the Sub-Antarctic fur seals take about 300 days to have their pup, to wean the pup before the pup leaves. But the Antarctic fur seals probably take about 90 days, and that's usually because they're much further south when daylight hours are a lot less than the Sub-Antarctic. So they have a much shorter sort of breeding season, if you like, from when the pups are born to when they're weaned compared to the Sub-Antarctic species. So it's quite interesting seeing the two species together on the same island. And the third seal that's very noticeable on the island, I've showed you the photo of the the young elephant seals earlier. This is a breeding colony of elephant seals. Again, the males come out before the season starts and takes up territory. A dominant male may only have 2 or 3 years left in him. They come out onto the islands, they take up territory, and they don't go out to sea again to feed. They just spend the next few months defending the territory. So life's very hard for a dominant male bull, and 2 or 3 years later they'll be pushed off the site by a much younger, stronger male. You can see the size of the male weighs something like 3,500 kilos, so it's not to be messed with. And then you see the female in the foreground, a lot smaller, and then there's a pup just underneath the flipper of the male, again very much smaller. And they get the name elephant seal because of the nose, which they can blow up as part of their displays. It's either an aggressive display against males. The bigger the nose, the more aggressive they are and more dominant they are. But one thing we always had to be careful with whenever we were out around the island, and this breeding colony here was actually part of a penguin colony as well, where I spent many a day observing giant petrels and skuas predating the penguins. But you always had to be careful about not getting too close, because they could move at a hell of a rate, and if they landed on top of you, you would know about it. And there is a story about one of the guys, somebody working in South Georgia, that he was late getting back from some research work somewhere, and then people were getting worried. And when he finally turned up, the story was that an elephant seal had landed on top of him, but because the snow was so soft, he got pushed into the snow rather than getting flattened. So whether that's an actual story or an old wives' tale, I'm not sure, but he certainly treated these animals with quite a lot of respect. Then after 2 or 3 months, the pups, if they were healthy, they were just a barrel of blubber. Elephant seal milk is extremely rich, and they put on a lot of weight in a very short period of time. And then the females breed again and disappear, and the youngsters just sort of, once they get hungry, they live on their fat for quite a while, and when they're hungry they have to go off into the sea and start fending for themselves. And it's interesting that the history of a lot of these sub-Antarctic islands has always been one of exploitation by humans, people sealing, whaling, and all the rest of it. And the elephant seal population on Prince Edward's was virtually decimated at one stage, and then when sealing stopped, certainly through the 1940s and 50s, the numbers increased to a population estimated of about 30,000 animals, 3,500 pups. But by the 60s, for whatever reasons, the population started to decline again. And by the time we got to the 80s, mid-80s, the population was only estimated at about 2,000, with an annual production of about 600 pups. And a lot of research has been done on the islands and Prince Edward's and elsewhere in the Southern Oceans, looking at why these declines have happened. Another penguin that we had a few pairs on the islands. These are Gentoo penguins, probably only about 1,500 pairs nested in very small, discrete colonies. So it's more of a southern, more an Antarctic species. But one interesting thing is in the south, obviously they breed during the summer months, but on the Prince Edwards, they actually breed during the winter months. And this could be just a defense against predation, whereas the predatory birds, the skuas and the giant petrels disappear by and large during the winter months. So if the penguins breed in the winter, they've got a better chance of raising some youngsters. And as with the other two species of penguins, the youngsters crash together once they get to a certain age, and for safety in numbers, and while the parents go off to feed them. So about 1,500 pairs of Gentoo nest here. So that's the sort of the beaches really. There's not a lot of the coastline. there's not a lot of places for birds to come onto the islands under their own steam. So the penguins and the seals, they have a limited part of the coast where they can get ashore. A lot of the coastline, the majority of the coastline, is actually made up of cliffs. Some of them are quite tall, others are fairly small cliffs, but still a barrier to things like the penguins and the seals coming ashore. I keep mentioning going between Marion Island and Prince Edward Island. Basically, Prince Edward Island is probably one of the most pristine subantarctic islands anywhere in the world. It hasn't suffered from some of the problems that Marion Island has suffered from. And it's really hard. They virtually have no landings on Prince Edward anymore to be able to make sure that no species are introduced onto the island, to keep it as pristine as possible. But I was fortunate enough to have a couple of trips across there back in the 80s. We went over for a day, one day to do something, and then we had 2 or 3 days over there, camped over there towards the end of my stay. But one bird you will find on Prince Edward that you won't find on Marion is the yellow-nosed albatross. There's about 5,000 pairs of yellow-nosed breeding on Prince Edward, but they don't breed on Marion. And I think this was the only yellow-nosed albatross I actually saw on my trip down there. One of the other things that's happened since the mid-80s is a lot of the names have changed and taxonomy has changed. So I think this is now the Indian yellow-nosed albatross as opposed to the Atlantic yellow-nosed albatross. So quite a few birds have changed their names in the last 30 odd years since my time down there. And cliffs, they obviously a lot of cliffs are on the sea, by the sea, but there's a lot of cliffs in the interior as well. This is a ridge of cliffs. It's called grey-headed albatross ridge, obviously for a reason. You can see all the white dots on the ridge. They're all grey-headed albatrosses nesting. And in the foreground of the picture, you can see a little bit better some of the fresher lava that's on the island. This black, brittle, very sharp, jagged lava that's been laid down basically since the last ice age. So grey-headed albatross, it's a smaller albatross compared to birds like the wandering albatross. In a good season, they can breed. They can breed every year. I think their egg-laying stage is about 60 days or so, about 3 months to raise a chick. So they can complete a breeding season in 1 year. And obviously, if they fail earlier in the year, they're more likely to attempt the second year. Most of these albatrosses and the petrels and the other seabirds, it's important to remember that they only lay 1 egg a year. And if they lose their egg or lose their chick, that's the breeding season over until the next year. But most of these birds are fairly long-lived. I mean, some of the albatrosses can live to be 60, 70 years old. There's some recorded cases, certainly of the northern, the albatrosses in New Zealand living to be 60, 70 years old. And that's an albatross chick, typical sort of albatross chick. They all look fairly similar with a few distinctive features. Quite cute, really, if you like that sort of thing. You can see they're sitting on a nest. All the albatrosses make one of these little nests. It's just built up with mud and vegetation. Not very big considering the size of the birds that we're dealing with, but they lay their single egg in the nest, hatch it, and as the chick gets bigger and bigger, then obviously they stop brooding the chick. And the chicks stay on this nest until they're ready to fledge. They don't crash together or anything like the penguins, for instance. And these are the grey-headed albatrosses just before they're ready to fledge. These are all youngsters ready to go. And if you just look amongst the birds, you can see them all, most of them sitting on top of their little round nest. And grey-headeds, there's 4,800, nearly 5,000 pairs nesting on Prince Edward's, and that equates to about 23% of the world's population. 2 other sort of cliff nesting ledge nesting albatrosses that are found on the islands, and it's the same. Mentioned the Sub-Antarctic and the Antarctic fur seals, and these two species, one's an Antarctic species and one is a Sub-Antarctic species. And I think Marion Island, Prince Edward's are the only islands in the world where they actually both breed on the same island. And this is the sooty the dark mantled sooty albatross, 2,800 pairs or so, again nearly a quarter of the world's population. And then there are a handful, maybe about 215 pairs, which is a very small portion of the world's population, of light-mantled sooty albatross. And these light-mantled sooty albatrosses tend to be more of a southern albatross, or further south than the dark-mantled. But the same, Prince Edward Islands is one of the, I think, the only island in the world where you'll see both of them actually nesting together. And then the cliffs, just carry on with the cliffs. You get a few, obviously being of volcanic origins, you get all sorts of shapes and structures around the islands. I say penguins do have problems getting in onto the islands in some areas, but some areas they can find a way. This is a rockhopper penguin colony. It's quite high above the sea, but there's a sea cliff. The hole in the centre of the photo of the colony is a sea cliff, so the birds can come ashore onto a rocky beach, walk through the sea cliff, and then climb up, walk up to the top of the ridge where they have their nests. And these are rockhopper penguins. I think since when I was there, they were just called rockhopper penguins. There's now, I think, there's a northern and a southern rockhopper penguin. I think they've been split. This is the smallest of the 4 penguins on the islands, and about 128, 130,000 pairs, which equates to about 3% of the world population. So not so important an island for rockhoppers, but certainly very important for kings and macaronis. And these nests, the 2 different breeding strategies are quite interesting. The macaroni and the rockhoppers, which is superficially, they look quite similar. The macaronis are a little bit larger. They both lay 2 eggs. But the macaronis, they lay a small first egg, and when the second egg is laid, they kick the first egg out of the nest. So obviously they're providing a lot of food for the predators, for the skuas and the gulls, and the people living on the island as well. They're quite tasty, actually. And then the rockhoppers, they have 2 eggs, but they always attempt to hatch 2 eggs. But very rarely do they raise 2 youngsters. One youngster usually disappears or is predated. So 2 slightly different strategies of raising a youngster. And on the cliffs as well, there's another species which fairly limited in number. And this one has got a few different names. When I was there, we were calling them imperial cormorant. It's also called a blue-eyed shag, red-footed shag, king cormorant. So there's a few various names, and no doubt the taxonomy's changed probably over the last 30 years as well, but really attractive, about the size of the European shag, really nice blue-eyed pink legs. And during the beginning of the breeding season, when they're in fine plumage, it's a really nice blue sheen to their feathers. They're fairly scattered around some of the cliffs around the island, maybe about 350 pairs. And then before I finish the first half, just going to look at another habitat type. This is called Feldmark and slopes. Slopes is my bit, but the Feldmark is an area of basically barren ground where there's very little vegetation. You can just see here in this photo the green cushions, and this is some of the pioneering vegetation that would have come onto these volcanic islands historically. They could have arrived on the feet or in the feathers of birds. They could have been wind assisted. But once they start to take hold in some of these more barren landscapes, it's called, I'm not sure what the English name is, it's called Azarella, it's the family name, but it's basically a cushion, very tightly packed cushion, and obviously once it dies, it starts to produce a humus layer, and it also allows other plant species, some of the grasses and other species that gradually colonize these islands to take root, and the vegetation gradually changes. But these sort of open feldmark areas are very good for two species of terns. Not very many pairs, maybe about 50 pairs of each. This is the globally the more common one. This is the Antarctic tern, which is the sort of southern equivalent, if you like, of the Arctic tern. And they're just scattered around these open areas, you know, fairly discrete colonies. They're not very big colonies. They're almost just ones and twos here and there. So it looks very similar to an Arctic tern, really. And you can see our Antarctic terns if you go to Cape Town during the winter months. There's often Antarctic terns on the foreshore around Cape Town. The second more interesting species of tern is this one. It's about the size of a marsh tern, so maybe about the size of a black tern. And this is probably one of the rarest terns in the world. This is called the Kerguelen tern. And there's probably a world population of about maybe 5,000 pairs, and they're only found on Prince Edward's, Crozet and Kerguelen, very, very restricted range. Probably about 50 pairs found on Marion. And then the slopes are what I call, they're areas that have obviously been colonized over the years with by vegetation. If you strip the vegetation away, you just have loads of rock, volcanic rock, nooks and crannies and crevices everywhere. But once all of this vegetation has taken hold, with a lot of birds coming in to use these slopes for nesting and adding nutrients to the ground, the vegetation grows better. And you have some large colonies of ground nesting birds. So just to finish the first half, I'm going to run through a few of the species that we might see. There are hundreds of thousands of petrels, prions. These are Salvin's prion. And again, the taxonomy's sort of changed over the years, but these are sort of broad, got quite a wide, broad bill on them. And say maybe hundreds of thousands of pairs of these nest on the islands. A couple of storm petrels nest there, maybe about into the thousands of black-bellied storm petrel. Into the hundreds, grey-backed storm petrel, very small storm petrel. And I think this, I always remember as a child reading the Guinness Book of Records, that I think this was one of the most numerous breeding seabird in the world. I'm sure it was the grey-backed storm petrel. Couple of diving petrels, so in effect they look a bit like a little auk when they're flying, that sort of small, compact, dumpy bird. Virtually impossible to tell when they're in the field because they look very similar, but when we can catch them, these are common diving petrels. The bill structure is a little different to the other one. Numbers run probably into their thousands. And then a slightly smaller, this is a South Georgian diving petrel. The bill structure is a little bit different. Again, probably in the thousands of pairs. And if you catch them, you can look at their feet. Underneath their feet, they have a black line down the leg, which is quite a good distinctive feature. But obviously something you wouldn't see when a bird is just whizzing by. Then there are some larger, sort of more shearwater-sized petrels. This is white-chinned petrel, so it's probably a bit bigger than a Manx. They're in their tens of thousands of pairs, and quite bizarrely, this is now on the British list because one turned up in Orkney about 3 years ago. Where it came from, how it got there, nobody knows, but it was accepted as a wild bird, and it's now on the British list. Another bird which is possibly familiar if you do see watching around Britain. Well, it would have been until they changed their names. This is a soft plumage petrel, and this is the bird that they always considered the birds around Madeira, Canary Islands, Xenos, but they've been changed now. Things like Xenos petrel, they've been split from the southern soft plumage petrel. But soft plumage petrels around Prince Edward's, about 1,000, well, birds into the thousands of breeding pairs. Another small petrel, tens of thousands of these, just a very nondescript. Kerguelen petrel, pretty common. Tens of thousands of blue petrels, quite distinctive when you actually see them flying, as they have a a little white tip on the end of their tail. And then a couple of the larger petrels, just to finish with. These are great winged petrels, tens of thousands of pairs scattered around. And then the largest petrel that's on the island, breeding on the island, is probably in the thousands. These are grey petrels. And interestingly enough, the grey petrel and the great winged petrels are actually winter breeders rather than summer breeders. So all of these birds, all these photos of birds at night were taken when I had a second trip to Prince Edward, and one of the things we did was to put up mist nets, and we had flashlights and everything, and we caught a lot of these night birds, and we plucked a feather off each of the species' backs, and they took all these feathers away for analysis of pollutants and mercury and what have you. So that was the excuse for going out, catching these birds at night. Okay, so end the first half with a sunrise as opposed to a sunset. Okay.
Thank you, Neil. We're now going to have a 10-minute break where we're going to have some refreshments and look at some books that Neil's brought along with him. So we'll see you all at home back here, hopefully in about 10 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to start off the second half, finishing off the habitats. This is the sort of one of the dominant habitats around between the sea and the cliffs when the land starts to rise, and this is the area of what I call coastal grasslands, mires and bogs. You can see it's very wet. Very interesting trying to walk around. There's obviously no paths and things out on the islands, so we have to make our own ways around. We don't always get it right. We used to end up in bogs quite frequently. But it was always an interesting workout, and I've probably never been as fit in my life as I was for those 2 years down south. But these coastal plains are very important, large open expanses of grasslands, quite a few little rivers and streams which flow through them, these little valleys, and some of the valleys are quite important for some of the penguins. This is a small king penguin colony and a small molting area. But one of the main species that we have on these coastal grasslands are one of the most important birds really on the island, and that's the wandering albatross. This area is called Goni Plain, and a goni is another word for an albatross, and you can see all the white dots dotted around. They are all wandering albatross nests. Wandering albatross, one of the largest flying birds in the world. It's something like 3.5 meters wingspan from tip to tip. Quite a large, very large bird. They have this very elaborate courtship. They won't start breeding till they're maybe 6-7 years old. They can come back to the islands for 2 or 3 years once they start to mature and form these pair bonds with other wanderers before they actually start nesting. They could be 8 to 10 years old before they start nesting. And as I said before, a lot of the albatrosses, certainly the larger albatrosses, can live to be 50, 60, 70 years old. And it's a royal albatross, which is similar to the wandering, which has the longevity record, something like 65, 70 years. And again, typical albatross, obviously their nests are slightly bigger because the birds are a little bit bigger. But they lay their single egg. They hatch the egg after about 12 weeks or so, 10, 12 weeks. And the chick gradually grows and grows until it gets to such a size that both parents leave the chick and go off to sea to feed. And they can circumnavigate the southern oceans. They can go all the way around the world on a single feeding trip to bring food back for their youngster. And then the youngsters, they should be brown. So, but this one, not quite sure what's happened to it, but it came out silver instead of brown. We put a ring on it, but it never turned up again, as far as we're aware. But the wandering albatross, something like 2,800 pairs nest on Prince Edward's, which is at least 15% of the world's breeding population. And then the coming on to the predators now. Obviously, there's no birds of prey on the island, but other birds take the role of predators. And this was one of the reasons that I went down to Prince Edward's. The job I had was a field research assistant, and I was collecting data on giant petrels and skuas, which are the main predatory species. And the giant petrels nested in sort of loose colonies around the island, and there's two species. The most numerous is the southern giant petrel, giganteus. It's a large version of the fulmar in many respects. So when you think of what a fulmar can do when it throws its contents of its stomach at you, you can imagine what these things can do. And there's probably about 3,200 pairs of southern giant petrels, which is about 8% of the world population. It took me a while to get my head around identifying them, but basically the southern giant petrel has this greenish tip to the end of its bill. And then the closely related northern giant petrel has this reddish tip to the end of the bill. There's probably about 400 pairs on the Prince Edward's, about 6% of the British population. And then the third predatory species that I was there to help study was the Sub-Antarctic Skua, very much like a bonksy, really. And again, they just had territories spread across the islands often. And one of the jobs I had to do was to actually go around finding the nesting territories, because most of the breeding pairs, they had a midden, the place where they used to take all their food to. So all the detritus from previous meals were often always spread around a small area. So some of these birds just specialised feeding in penguin colonies. So you had lots of bits of carrion, you had eggshells and what have you. Others were actually specialised in catching some of the petrels, the prions and the storm petrels. So most of their middens were full of parts of other birds. So we were able to build up a picture of the effect that some of these predatory birds were having on other bird populations. And as with the bonksy, the giant great skua, the Sub-Antarctic Skua has the same sort of lifestyle. Gets very aggressive if you get near them. If you get too close, they'll come down and have you. You just see the chick on the top left there is hidden in the undergrowth, just circled with a blue circle. So most of these birds are very approachable. They don't see very many humans, so it's always easy to get close to them. But if you do get too close, the birds will react. The fourth sort of predatory species we had was a gull. This is the Cape gull. Kelp gull, KELP, which are also found in southern Africa. And I think this is now the Cape gull, of which one turned up in the UK recently. Maybe about 200, 250 pairs scattered around the islands. But they sometimes attract other things, and we started to see this very pale kelp gull, and there's myself and two other British guys working on the islands in the same year, and we just couldn't get our heads around what this was. And then eventually the penny dropped, and it was actually a lesser blackback gull, which they do find they just reach South Africa in very tiny numbers. And I think this was the first sub-Antarctic record of a lesser blackback, which is one of my few claims to fame. And then the final habitat There's obviously, it's an island, it's in the middle of the sea. The sea is not, I mean, it's very rich. There's a lot of things in the sea, but not a lot of things that we would actually see ourselves. But the main sort of dominant presence in the oceans were the killer whales, which, as I said before, they came in during the spring and they over summer, feeding on the penguins and the seals that use the islands. And there's quite a few people really keen on seals, and they were identifying individual animals and building up a picture of the population. So this is a large male, huge dorsal fin, and smaller female with a youngster. As I say, very common around the islands during the spring and the summer. Right, that's the sort of quick look around at the sort of habitats and some of the wildlife that was there. I'm just going to briefly touch on the human history of the islands, because it makes a bit of sense about what goes on there or what has gone on there. The islands were actually discovered officially in 1772. That's the first recorded discovery of the island, but that discovery wasn't realised until a few years later. And in 1776, James Cook, on one of his voyages around the world, passed the islands as well. And at the time, they were unknown. The previous sighting of the islands hadn't been recorded. So Cook, in his wisdom, he claimed the islands for Britain. In the days when we claimed everything we found, and from 1776, the islands were known as a British possession. A few years later, Cook found out that a Dutchman had actually sighted the islands in 1772, and as a sort of tribute to the captain, which is a guy called Marion de Fresney, he named the larger of the two islands Marion Island, and he named the island group Prince Edward Islands, and the smaller of the two islands became Prince Edward. Even though he named the island after Marion, he certainly didn't give it to the Dutch. They stayed as a British possession. And you can still see quite a few signs of early human activity. Within a few years of the islands being discovered, sealers were down there, whalers were down there. They used to drop men off for up to a year, and they'd go around the islands slaughtering all of the seals. Some people were stuck on the islands unintentionally. You just seeing scraped into the cliff there. There's a name, a guy called Heistad. I think he was a Swedish. They were sealers or whalers. And they got shipwrecked on the island twice, so they had an enforced stay there until another ship came by. And bear in mind, this is not an island group that's on the way to anywhere. People had to actually go there for a purpose. And still a few other odds and ends. This was a small cave, bit of timber still lying around, an old kettle, an old gun, bit of an old rifle. A lot of the artifacts have been removed from the island since the late 40s, and a lot of them now are back on mainland South Africa and Cape Town. I think there's a museum where you can see a lot of the original stuff that was brought back. There's one tripod. This is a place when the sealers were put ashore, they were obviously killing the seals, and they had to boil down the blubber for the oil. And you've probably seen from all of the photos so far, there's not a single tree on the island. It's totally treeless. And what they used to do to create the fires, to boil the blubber, to get the oil, was to chuck a few penguins on the fire. So apart from the seals being decimated by sealers, they were also decimating the bird life, using them as fuel for the fire. Apart from these early sealing days, there is a possible record of somebody actually seeing the islands as early as the 1660s. There's some old nautical journals where there's references to an island in the south, which could well have been Prince Edward Islands, which is at least 100 years before they were officially discovered. But the actual official discovery was put down to James Cook and Marion de Fresnay, and they were always considered British. And then we had the Second World War, and obviously the British economy by then was in quite a bad state, and Britain still had these islands in their possession. And a visit to the island, they found munitions. They found German munitions on the island. So there was a worry with the British, at least, that if an unfriendly power annexed or took over the islands, they could use the islands to launch an attack on the Cape shipping routes. So very much a cloak and dagger scenario then happened in 1947, and the British government suggested to the South Africans that they go down to the islands and annex the islands as part of South Africa, and that's what happened in late 1947, early 1948. A very secret operation took place, and the South Africans claimed the islands for South Africa. And they annexed Marion Island first because it was easier to land on, and then in January 48 they annexed Prince Edward Island. If you're interested in finding a bit more, there's a great book called No Pathway Here, and this was written by a guy called John Marsh, who was he was a journalist who was sworn to secrecy, and he went down with the annexation sailing, and he wrote about the experience and the what happened on the islands when they were annexed to become part of South Africa. And Prince Edward, the original flagpole is still there. So the photo, two photos back where it showed you all the sailors lined up and the flag, this is the original flagpole. It was moved into a little bit of a cave on Prince Edward, and that was me standing by it in 1986. So it had been up there for nearly 40 odd years. So the islands then became South African, and the very first thing they did is they set up a weather station in 1948, soon after annexation, and there's been a continuous presence on the island since 1948. It's been predominantly a weather station because there's very little land mass in the Southern Ocean, so it collects important meteorological data. And since the certainly 1950s and into the 60s, there's been a lot of research, biological research undertaken on the islands. And obviously that's one of the reasons I was down there by the time we got to the 80s. So there is a base on the sort of northeast corner. Bearing in mind that we can't pop out to the local shop. We live. Once the ship comes down, obviously we get some fresh food, some fresh fruit and fresh eggs and vegetables and what have you. But most of the time we have to live on tinned stuff and make our own, frozen veggies and frozen meats and stuff. We were also issued with apart from a kit allowance, we could turn up at the government depot totally naked, and we'd come out the other end kitted out with everything we could need clothes-wise. But we were also issued with a personal allowance, and it was 6 bottles, if I remember, 6 bottles of spirits, 2 cases of wine, 10 cases of beer, 2 cases of soft drinks, and a hell of a lot of chocolate. And these became currency on the islands. I wasn't a great alcohol drinker, but walking around the island, I always like to have a bar of chocolate with me. So a lot of bartering actually went on during the course of the year. I say the base was very basic. We had a sort of TV with a video. So we had loads of videos down there, and they were always rationed to maybe 1 or 2 a week, make sure we didn't watch them all in the first week. We made things like our own bread. We had a sort of cooking rota. So depending how many people were on the base, every few days, every week or 10 days or so. We actually, one person cooked for everybody else. So I introduced the South Africans to toad in the hole. I'm not sure whether they were very impressed or not, but that was one of my specialities. We had lots of, you know, as I said, in the winter months when I was there, there was seven base staff who were there the whole year, plus myself and an entomologist. And then during the summer months, we had a team of other people come down. So during the summer, there was 31 people on the islands, but we had to still make our own entertainment, if you like. So things like certainly the base staff, who by and large had to stay on the base. So we had a library and jigsaws and stuff like that. We made our own entertainment. We were earning money, but we never spent it. But I don't think the monopoly money ever became real money. But we used to have little various parties and evenings in, and just to break up the monotony. When it was people's birthdays, we just pulled a lot of the drinks and things and had sort of formal birthday parties. Somebody built a small gym. This is the only time I went into the gym was to take a photo. Killer whale fever was rife on the islands when I was there, especially amongst the base people. And when killer whales were sighted offshore, the first thing people did was go to the emergency alarm system and set all the alarms off. And we knew that it wasn't an emergency. We knew that killer whales were coming by. So we had fantastic views of killer whales. I mean, this is a female and a calf. Once the animals came quite close into the rocks, somebody used to go down and start splashing the water, and these magnificent animals would come in and have a look and see what was going on. And we've got some video footage of this couple here, this female and a calf, and a male came in from the top and literally went between the rocks and the female with the calf and steered them away. So really intelligent animals. A couple of the guys thought it'd be good to go swimming with a killer whale, so he made himself a cage, dangled it down from the crane. Didn't realise there was actually a killer whale swimming by at the time when this photo was taken. The base staff were made up, the 7 base staff. We had a radio technician, we had a diesel mechanic, we had a medic, we had 3 meteorologists, and a radio operator. So there were 7 base staff with the core people on the island. So we had a medic who dealt with a lot of minor ailments. The meteorologists, they monitored the weather 24/7 on sort of 8-hour shifts, sending up weather balloons and taking data and readings and what have you. Occasionally it got very, very windy. The further right it goes, the windier it is. We had some really blustery, staggeringly blustery days, and there were a few days when I was actually caught outside in some of this wind. Ended up sort of crawling back to the base because it was so windy, and there's basically no shelter anywhere. So the entomologist Steve that was there, he did a PhD on the invertebrates on the island, which were weevils and a flightless moth. He's made a living out of, he's now a professor in a university in Australia, I think, so made a living out of his experiences on the island. During the takeover period, when the ship came down to swap personnel and bring supplies, we had other people come down to do various projects with us. This is Sue, one of the researchers from the same people that I was working for. We actually caught king penguins and we put them inside these barrels, and she fed them a known amount of fish every day, and she collected what came out at the other end and did lots of physiology studies. So some of the wonderful research that people, how they even think about it in the first place, I don't know, but all added to the variety. So there are a lot of field huts. There's about 8 field huts around the island. There's one in the centre of this picture. I spent most of my time out in the field, and during the winter months, I basically had the whole island to myself. So I just disappear into this island the size of Malta and walk around it on my own and stay in field huts, which was absolutely wonderful. I think nowadays they're in a bit of better condition than this, but these are the sort of old huts that we had. Each of the huts had its own pet skua. I mean, they're always on the lookout for a free meal. Yeah, just sort of go through a little bit of the work that I did. I went down as a field research assistant. My boss was another British guy who had worked for the British Antarctic Survey, and he was studying the effects of the giant petrels and the Sub-Antarctic skuas on other birds on the islands. And so I spent a lot of time just doing observation works. So doing timed periods, watching what happens inside penguin colonies, watching for predation. So sometimes it would, like the little huts, one of the pictures earlier with the small huts overlooking the large king penguin macaroni colony. I sat in a hut for sort of 12 hours a day, or daylight hours, just observing what was happening with giant petrels and skuas. And so this was like a quadrat. I think it was about a 50-meter square quadrat. When a giant petrel came into the quadrat, I just, in live time, just recorded everything it did, whether it was trying to feed on penguins, whatever. Occasionally they would come into the quadrat, sit down and go to sleep for 3 hours. So I spent 3 hours watching a sleeping giant petrel, which certainly taxes the patience, that's for sure. And this is what we were looking for, giant petrels. They're the scavengers, they're the vultures of these sub-Antarctic islands. They clean up the mess, if you like. Quite a lot of penguins are injured coming ashore. They could be hit, they could hit rocks, they could cut themselves, they could be attacked by killer whales. But if they've got any sort of injury when they come into a penguin colony, the giant petrels just go for them, and literally from arriving in the colony, they could be stripped to the bare bones within about 30 minutes. These giant petrels just devour them. Another thing I did a lot of going out at night with flashlights, catching giant petrels, taking biometric readings, weighing them, measuring their beaks, measuring their legs, and so on, putting rings on them. Spent a lot of time doing that. Got a lot of food sampling as well, and this was find somewhere where there's a number of giant petrel nests and just sit down patiently, wait until the adults come along. They feed the chicks, and then I go and grab the chick and turn it upside over a bucket, rub its tummy, and its dinner comes out. So we were able to analyse what they were eating, whether it was fish, whether it was squid, whether it was carrion. Obviously, we only did this once in a while. We never did it regularly to make sure that the chicks didn't starve. So collected lots of food sampling to see what the birds were feeding on. The skuas as well. It was, like I said before, we went out checking the middens, catching, finding whether they're eating penguin eggs, whether you'd find wings of petrels or carrion of bits of penguin or whatever. Finding out what the skuas were feeding on. Cats. One of the problems with the humans, when the first weather station was set up, they had a mice problem. All the mice were introduced on the islands from the sealing days. Obviously, when they set up a weather station, they had mice everywhere coming into their lodgings. So what do you do when you have mice? You bring some cats down. They took 5 cats in 1949. Males and females. By 1965, there were 2,500 cats, killing 500,000 seabirds every year. Absolutely crazy. But there has been a cat eradication program since then, and given them their due over a sort of 6-7 year period. Started in the year I was there, but by the early 90s, they had completely eradicated cats from the island, and the bird populations went back through the roof. Spent a lot of time ringing albatrosses in particular. I soon found out the easiest way of catching a wandering albatross was to grab its neck, put it between your legs, pull its leg out, put a ring on it, and then walk away quickly. And they'd just shake themselves and carry on with whatever they were doing. But rather an interesting experience. I did have a trip to Prince Edward. Prince Edward's 18 kilometres across the water from Marion, so I'm lucky enough to have had a couple of trips there. We stayed we camped for about 3 nights, and this was a trip, apart from counting birds during the day, we were also catching lots of the petrels and prions at night. And obviously the difference between Marion Island and Prince Edward was staggering. You know, there's no cats on Prince Edward, there's no mice on Prince Edward, and the bird numbers were through the roof compared to Marion. The experience, it was an experience. You know, I think we all have experiences through our lives, you know, birding experiences amongst others, and I think this is the one that I'll take with me to my grave. That even now I can remember. I can't remember what I did yesterday, but I can remember what I did 35 years ago, and it was such an experience that, you know, it was a privilege to be able to go there. So we had all this kit supplied with. You know, about 5 minutes after the photo, we were so hot, we were just stripping off and walking. So this was for the camera only. We got to know a lot of the wildlife, you know, including individual birds. We had a pair of skuas, male and a female. Got to know them quite well. Just the closeness and the friendliness, if you like, of the wildlife there was absolutely amazing. They weren't worried about man. You know, they were pretty oblivious to our presence most of the time. Photography was easy. You know, you didn't need big cameras, just a small lens. You know, you get really close to a lot of these animals. When we finished our final trip on the island before we came back home, we were treated to a around the island trip in the helicopter, which took about 30 minutes, as opposed to about 2 days of walking around. That was quite a fitting end, really. We had a bit of leisure time where we could go off walking around the islands without the thoughts of work, including a trip up to the summit of the island. It was a healthy lifestyle. Fitness levels went through the roof. We just drank out of streams and things. Never been as fit in my life as I was then. We had a few extra bonuses. We had humpback whales on occasions come through. Somebody mentioned leopard seals earlier. We had one immature juvenile leopard seal turn up. But fortunately, they didn't actually breed on the islands. This was just a vagrant. 1 or 2 vagrant birds turned up on the year I was there, including pectoral sandpiper, which was quite an interesting bird. We had a very poor shot on the left. We had 2 green shanks, and then we had a Hudsonian whimbrel, the American race of whimbrel turned up as well. So it's quite a good year for vagrants during my year there. And then just briefly finish off with a couple of images of the islands, really, just to give you a feel for the landscapes. So penguins, some macaroni penguins again. That's the latest. That was a 1980 eruption that happened. Very fresh lava there. Lots of geological structures. Lots of coves. Most of the days when the photos were taken, it was nice, but it wasn't like this every day. Just spectacular scenery, spectacular wildlife, and a real experience. I just want to finish now briefly for 2 minutes, if I may, just to bring us to the end. The islands are still there. There's still a program of research on the islands. They've got rid of the cats, which has made a huge difference, but they're now suffering badly from another alien introduction. There's a new base now. The one on the left is where I lived. The one on the right is a relatively new base. One of the problems the islands are suffering from now, sort of 35 years on from my visit, is climate, as with a lot of places everywhere else around the world. The island's becoming much drier, and some of the prevailing winds and things are changing. You know, the rainfall is changing, which is all having in the short term, it's having some effect on the wildlife. In the long term, who knows? But right, I'll put this as a warning with a distressing image coming up. So if you're a bit squeamish, it might be worth looking away. One of the major problems a lot of these southern islands, sub-Antarctic islands, are suffering from now is predation by house mice. Marion's no different. There's been recently an eradication program on Gough, which is about 95% successful. A lot of the New Zealand islands, the Australian islands, South Georgia, they're all trying to remove mice from the islands, because the mice, with the islands drying out, mice are spreading in some areas, they're breeding, they're decimating a lot of their sort of natural food, if you like. Some of the invertebrates are being decimated, so they've turned their attention to eating albatross, petrels and other birds, and they're eating them alive. And there's a lot of footage. If you go onto YouTube and the internet, there's loads and loads of footage of this happening, not just on the Prince Edwards, but around the world as well. And the South Africans, BirdLife South Africa, have introduced a sponsorship initiative. They're trying to raise £1.5 million to try to eradicate mice from Marion, and it is practical, it is possible, but you know, it's dependent on a lot of conditions. But the first condition, obviously, is to get funding to do it. If you're interested in finding out more, there's a mousefreemarion.org website, or if you just Google Marion Island mice or something, you'll pick up the links. I sent £750 last year when I sold the yearbook last year. I put a percentage of each sale towards the Mouse Free Marion project, and I ended up sending about £750 across to towards the whole project. They're aiming to do the work in 2024. If you want to find out more about how it works and the problems and all the rest of it, then certainly worth having a look at the website and the information that's there. But so that's just a postscript, really, to what was sort of 14 years out of my life, which you know, it's certainly up there with most of the best things I've ever done. I always have to say, being at the birth of my children was the first three best things in my life, but certainly Marion came a very, very, very close fourth. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Neil. Thank you very much. That was fascinating. It must have been a dream come true for you, I would have thought, to go and work on the islands like that.
I had to think hard about whether I wanted to do it.
Yeah, I'm sure you did. Yeah. And the size of those albatrosses too, they're huge.
The wandering albatrosses, yes, very, very, very large.
Can I just ask, the birds that you put into the drums to feed and monitor what came out there, how long were they in that drum for?
It was only a couple of weeks or something.
Oh, right.
They were fed and the poo was collected. And
and then they were just let go again.
Oh, yeah.
Good, okay. Briefly, we have a few minutes if anybody does have any questions for Neil. Anybody here or anybody at home?
When I see the penguins breeding high up on the mountain slopes, I think surely they must have thought that being able to fly would be an advantage.
Possibly.
Penguins have lost the ability to fly, yet hawks in the northern hemisphere.
Yeah, it's just evolution, I suppose. But they fly underwater, basically. They're designed for flying underwater. But there's probably not much need to fly in that sort of region, because few predators and all the rest of it. And they're better designed for feeding, which is what they need to do to survive.
Do the orcas coordinate their arrival time to the breeding season?
Yeah, they turn up in the spring when all
Neil, do you mind just coming here to answer the question so they can hear at home as well?
Sorry.
What was your question again?
When the killer whales arrive, they turn up sort of early spring when the seals are starting to pup, when the penguins are starting to lay their eggs. So they're coinciding with their food, basically, and then they breed themselves during the summer months. Yeah, and they disappear in the autumn and go off wherever they go off.
Is anybody asking a question at home, Jane? Do you know? No, no questions. No more questions. Okay, right. Well, I would imagine that's whetted a few people's appetites. Maybe they'd like to go to the Prince Edward Islands.
You'd never get there. It's a closed.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's
just not a.
It's not an option. There's no. If I can get £1.5 million together, I will donate it to them on the proviso they take me there. But I don't think that's going to happen.
Oh.
No, it's a protected nature reserve, and they keep. There's nobody's got a reason to go there. There's no shipping lanes or anything like that. But only tourism, if that ever happened. That's highly unlikely to happen. Yeah, they did take a ship down like in January that went close, but not close enough for my liking. But I would have liked to have seen the islands again, but no, it's not. It's never going to be opened up, and rightly so, because it's such a pristine environment.
Okay, right. Well, thank you very much, Neil. That really was fascinating. So if we could all at home unmute yourselves and thank Neil for visiting us today.